everyone, this is Dr. Liz, and you're listening to Include with Dr. Liz. This show is about everyone, all people, including you. It's about people and their diverse lived experience in this world. I chat with guests to get to know them, their identities, and their inclusion needs, so we all have an opportunity to understand how best to include them, so together we can create a world where everyone thrives. Shana is a beach-loving, processed food-despising, heart and kidney transplant-receiving, unrelenting optimist with a professional purpose to help people move through medical crisis and teach them how to be empowered through life or death circumstances. Shana is on a mission to help over 10 million people suffer less when faced with a medical issue. Welcome, Shana.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
It is so great to have you here today. Before we started pressing record, I went, an Australian accent. I love it. So you're in the US too, right?
I am. I'm in sunny San Diego.
Those of you that are listening that aren't from Australia, no, we don't know each other just because we both come from Australia. It's a little bigger than that.
It is slightly bigger.
It is. And so, Shana, you're from Darwin. Explain Darwin to people that aren't familiar.
Darwin is Australia's outback. So it truly is kangaroos, crocodiles, snakes, and spiders. That is Darwin.
If I think of Darwin, it is what Americans tell me they think of Australia, because they'll say everything in Australia can kill you, and I'm like, not if you're in the streets of Sydney, right? No,
right.
Yeah, it's a little bit like walking down the street of New York, right? Darwin, everything can kill you.
More likely in Darwin, there is higher likelihood.
It's also a very different place to grow up than it is in, say, a metropolitan city. Like, even though it is a city, it is very different in its demographic to say, Sydney. So help us understand, because I'd like to know the background of you, of where you were raised, before we then dive into your identities and lived experience.
Yeah, for sure. So you're right. Darwin is a very interesting city when it comes to culture and when it comes to diversity, because in 1975, there was a cyclone that wiped out a lot of the city. And because of that, there were a lot of immigrants that migrated to Darwin to help set it back up and rebuild the city. My family is from a country called East Timor, and East Timor now is the newest country of the millennium. And my family came from East Timor in 1975 when a war broke out. And so they had to escape as refugees, and they came to Darwin because Darwin was the closest city to East Timor, the closest Australian city.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how my family ended up there. And I'm first generation Australian, born there.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm now an immigrant of the US. So it's given me, I think it's given me a unique lens on what it is to be an immigrant, but also a lot of diversity in how to adapt in different cultures and circumstances, because the polarity of each of those lifestyles just in and of themselves is quite different.
Absolutely. And this is what I think will make our conversation quite interesting, is your ethnic minority, or in the US they would call it your racial minority experience. I'm curious, how similar or disparate was that being in Australia versus being in the US? So just for my benefit and for everybody else's, how old were you when you left Australia?
I was 22.
Okay, so you've had some adult experience, you had your educational upbringing there. I'm so curious to know. But before we start diving into that, there is also another part of you that I want to ask about. And I read in your sort of guest intake form is that you flatlined 3 hours before a surgery and saw the afterlife.
I did.
Can you tell us about that?
My kidneys failed Christmas Eve 2015. And that was after a couple of really amazing career years where I had won 30 odd digital awards for digital marketing and for video and for all of this like innovation and all of the things that you would think on a normal success list paper were good things, right? Like on paper were great things.
Tick.
Yeah, exactly. And I thought this is the perfect time for me to go home to Darwin to relax, celebrate with my family, recharge, and then come back. And on Christmas Eve, I found out my kidneys were failing. And I thought, what is happening? And I remember sitting in front of the doctor and he said, what do you do for work? And I said, I'm in advertising. And he said, have you felt tired? And I was like, yeah, I'm in advertising. That's what we do. We do tired, right? Like thing. And he was like, okay, does your back hurt? And I was like, what are you talking about? I'm in advertising. Like, what are you not hearing me say? Of course my back hurts. Like, that's what we do. We do tired and back hurts. That's goes with advertising. And come to find out that was not normal. And so I was sitting there listening to this doctor tell me that my kidneys were at 20%. And so fast forward, I come back to the US and I went on the journey of finding a kidney donor, getting on the kidney transplant list, being put on dialysis, finding who my doctors were going to be, like that whole journey. 2020, Labor Day weekend, my kidney donor was finally approved to donate a kidney to me
Okay.
after like 5 years. So we were super excited. They tell me at that same week, we have found a cyst on your right kidney that we think is cancerous. And I thought, after all of this, the same kidney you've been looking at for 5 years, now it's cancerous. And I thought, I'm going to die. I thought that's it for me. Like, I'm done. 2 days later, the cardiologist called and said, we've just found out your heart is also failing. So at this point, I thought, for sure, I'm dead. Like, I'm gone. This is done. This is the universe, God, whoever you believe in as a higher power is making sure that I know if there was any hope that I thought I was going to make it through this, they're letting me know that for sure I'm not.
Yeah, okay.
And so for 4 months, I worked through heart failure and I went to work every day. I was the COO of an advertising agency at the time. So I was like really in it. I was working, 10, 12 hours a day while in heart and kidney failure and getting myself put back onto the heart and kidney transplant list because now I needed both. I was admitted into hospital on December 22nd, 23rd, and finally put back on the list on Christmas Eve, 2020. And it was right in the middle of COVID.
That's the next thing I was going to say.
Yeah, it was right in the middle of all of that. So like I couldn't be around anyone. I couldn't touch anybody. Like I doubly had to social distance. It was a real thing. Even to go into a doctor's office was dangerous for me. So funnily enough, being in hospital was kind of dangerous because everybody in there was sick with COVID for the majority of people. We had been saying it's going to be a Christmas miracle. The doctors said it's still going to be 6 to 8 weeks, but you're here. You're on the list. You're in hospital. All good. We just wait. The next day, the phone rang at 10 p.m. on Christmas Day, and they said, we have a heart and a kidney for you.
Oh, the goosebumps I'm getting from head to toe.
Oh, it was a huge miracle. So the next day, the doctors came into my room. We were celebrating. They said, we're going to come back and get you in a couple of hours and take you to the OR. We're so excited. This is amazing. You're our Christmas miracle. And while they were standing there, I flatlined. And that's when it became a real miracle, was that I was actually my heart was set to stop on December 26th. When I flatlined, I remembered falling asleep. And then all of a sudden, I was in this infinite darkness where it was like as if your eyes were closed, but you were looking through your eyelids.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember looking around and going, what is this? Like, where am I? And then I thought, oh, and it dawned on me, I think I'm dead. And then all of a sudden, I'm standing there and it's a hallway, light, God and Jesus, and a wave of compassion washed over me. Like if you took every person in the world and times it by 10,000, like that much compassion just washed over my body. And I knew where I was. Now, mind you, I'm not even religious. So for this to happen to me was like, I'm the last person on the planet that this is going to happen to. I was born into a Catholic family, and at 8 years old, I refused to do my communion, hated going to church. Like I was the last person in the world that this would happen to. I then remembered coming back through the phases, and all of a sudden I'm asleep and I can feel someone trying to wake me up. And it was the nurse doing CPR. And I actually woke back up to the CPR and moved her off me and said, Margaret, relax. I just took a little nap. Where were we? And I sat back up and was completely normal,
Wow.
sitting there in front of the doctors. And
How
to
does an
this,
experience like that change you, Shana?
I don't know if it did, Liz, honestly.
Mm.
I think what happened was it deleted everything that I had been trained to be. Everything that I had had to adapt to, change myself to, adjust to, be appropriate with, be, more with, less with, better with, not so much with. It just in one foul swoop removed all of that and gave me the freedom to really just be me. And what I've learned is and I'm still learning. It's not an end process. But what I'm learning is that my definition of me now is whatever, whoever, however I feel in this particular moment. And then in the next one, and then in the next one, and then in the one in 5 minutes, and then in 10 minutes, like literally a discovery
Mm.
of like, oh, wow, I didn't even know I could feel like that, but here I am, like just really allowing for. So I think that's the biggest thing that it did was stripped off
Yeah.
all the stuff that has been layered on top of just being able to just be.
But what could have been such a traumatic experience? It sounds liberating, right? Just to remove all of expectations that either you're putting on yourself or others or society or whatever else it might be, and just to be you. I mean, it's beautiful, really.
It really is. And I consider it a true privilege
Mm.
to have that experience, to be able to lean upon.
You're
I just,
making me self-reflect on this, that, oh, this is coming up for me for the first time. So let's just see how we go with this. So when my son, 21-year-old son, Dominic, died by suicide in January last year,
so sorry.
most traumatic thing that I've ever encountered.
Yes.
And, it's everything that anyone might imagine, right? And I'm getting better. And I realized I heard someone saying, just it was in a group conversation, and I heard someone say how they're fearful of death. And I hadn't thought about it recently. I would have said I was fearful of death, but I hadn't thought about it recently. And I went, I'm not anymore. I'm not at all, in fact. I have no fear of death. And in fact, I don't have any fear at all anymore because I now feel liberated that nothing else in this world could be worse
Yeah,
than what I experienced. And for as bad as it was, like you're saying, I kind of feel privileged to be released of that fear and of
yeah.
those limitations. That there is no fear anymore of anything. Not that I would want anyone to ever have to go through what I went through or for their children to go through the same thing that my son did, but some good things can come from bad.
It can.
Yeah.
There are some good things. And what I will say, I appreciate so much that you've been able to um, see that, because there are so many paths you could have gone down. To be able to see such a huge privilege in life itself, no matter how it looks, just the fact that we are alive begins to give um, solace. I think what gives me room is I have an immense amount of grace where around me, people really can be however they feel like being. If you want
Mm-hmm.
to be grumpy all day, I'm with you 1,000%. You can be however you want to be. I'm good
Yeah.
with it. Like, it's part of how we are.
Yeah.
And having the ability, I think, to have grace
Mm.
for any human emotion that we're experiencing at any particular point, that's what I think has been the biggest shift in how I live.
And I want to just make sure we labor the point on the term grace. And I've only really started to adopt that term more recently. And have talked a lot about compassion because I come from an empathetic place, and that's where I guess I naturally came from for my inclusion work. But I think when you're talking about grace, right, it's not about being just empathetic and going, yeah, okay, I get where you're coming from. Grace means you make accommodations and space for people to be one thing now and one thing tomorrow, and that it's not just a fixed thing, that we can flex and life changes. And from that, we need to create space for people to be in the moment, and whether they're thriving or not, supply them what they need to be able to move through to the next moment. So I love that, Shana.
Thank you. I heard a definition of grace that included the word unmerited, for no reason at all, that
Yeah.
you would just move and shift with that person.
Yeah.
Not because you feel bad for them, not because there's empathy. It's just because they're a human being. Like, there's no,
I often say when I'm equipping people to be more inclusive of others in the workplace, I'll say, start to ask them, how can I best meet your needs so you can thrive in this? And when I say this, it could be whatever situation you're in. And then I say, when they ask for it, don't say why. I always say, don't say why. It's not your business. Your
none.
business is about equipping them to be the best they can be at work, right? Your business is not why they need it. And I think that comes back to that unmerited. Like, there doesn't have to be a motive behind fulfilling someone's need.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I have an agreement with my best friend.
Yeah.
If I call him and say I need yellow Skittles, I need them. Like, it
Yeah.
doesn't matter why. Like, you're my best friend. You've just got to go get them. And he's like, done. And it works for us, right?
Yeah.
Because it is that grace. It's the space of like, I'm sure she needs them for whatever. It might sound crazy to me, but if it's going to make her life easier, then get the yellow Skittles. It's so true.
High five through the Zoom. Okay, now I'm just looking at the time and we're halfway into our recording session
Amazing.
and we've only just done the introduction. I think I've made a new friend for life.
I
Okay,
love it.
just like every other guest, you did fill out a questionnaire and there's a really long list of identities and you ticked 5 of them. What are they for you?
So they are, I am a woman, phenomenal woman. Ethnic minority, a racial minority, cultural minority, and chronic illness.
We really focus on the whole person in this podcast series. So while we do call out the identities, I do that so people can see you're more than what we see. So I want to actually ask, because you've ticked ethnic and racial minority, and I actually want to look now at the differences between your lived experience in Australia and the US. And racial minority is a North American construct as race, and ethnicity is really what we refer to across the rest of the world. Um, Growing up in Australia, did you feel different because of your ethnicity, and do you think you were treated differently?
So, did I feel different? Yes. But what I loved about growing up in Darwin, we were all different because, Darwin, because of the circumstances of 1975 and the cyclone, Darwin was already made up with a huge community of Greek people, Italian people, Vietnamese refugees. It was lots of different Asian countries given the proximity to Asia, still is. So there's a very widespread cultural community as well as a very big and thriving Aboriginal community as well, because Darwin being the outback, there was a lot of Aboriginal communities, still is, that exist all around the city, or what is now the city. So I was very lucky to grow up feeling different, but in a good way, in the sense that we were all unique. And it wasn't unusual for school where I grew up to celebrate all the different countries regularly. Have like International Day where we would all dress up in each of our different cultures and different countries and learn about each other and from each other. At the same time, my parents were were political activists, very active in the community for the rights of countries that were oppressed or that were in war-torn countries. My dad now is the vice president of East Timor. And so I was very much exposed to a lot of different cultures young. So for me, it was good to be different. It was like your culture meant something in the sense of like you had the right to represent it and people wanted to know about it from where I grew up.
I mean, how empowering in a time when that was actually not the case for the majority of people in other parts of the Caucasian or Western world, right? That's brilliant. And in fact, I knew about the history of Darwin and Cyclone Tracy. Anyone can Google that if you want to know about it. That's the cyclone that Shana's referring to. What I'm curious about, and I get asked this a lot in the US around how here they'll say Asian American, Indian American, African American, so that the race is attached to their citizenship, for lack of a better term. Tell me, around in Australia, had you ever been called something Australian? Like, is that a term you remember hearing?
Not joined with like, you're an Australian East Timorese. This is me personally, and I'm cognizant that it is my own filter and my own experience. I don't ever remember seeing or relating to or hearing an immigrant as an immigrant. It was like, oh, you're Chinese and now you're in Australia. Like it was never like, there wasn't a label for that necessarily.
I agree. Oh, I want to ask a question about when you got to the States, and because it was 20 years ago, there'll be differences in, legislation and all that kind of stuff since when I've just arrived. But when I got here, there are all these forms you've got to fill out, whether it's for a new employer or when you're a supplier or vendor to a client, and you've got to tick all these boxes. Now, I was shocked. In fact, I felt confronted. So in Australia, I know that they're identifying, there's always the option for Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander to tick that. And then if you're not that, you just go, not that, right? But here it's got this list of, are you white? Are you African American? So on and so forth. And I remember looking at it going, I have never identified myself as white. Now, anyone that's listening or watching, my skin is white. But because I hadn't been raised in a social construct of race, I hadn't labeled myself as white. Ethnically, I knew I was Caucasian. So I found it awkward. Like almost didn't want to tick the white box because I know they are labeling me that, but I didn't see myself as that. So I'm curious, when you look at this list, what are you on that American list of ethnicities or races according to them?
Yeah, I've asked myself that question so many times. I was actually just, it was funny because I was just telling someone this story 2 days ago that I was sitting in a class with an Australian friend of mine here in the States. And we were talking about socioeconomics. And someone said, put your hand up if you're an immigrant. And him and I just sat there. And then we both went, oh, we're immigrants. Like,
Yeah.
that's us. Like we hadn't even registered and we'd already been living here for like 5 years. So it was like hadn't even registered. And so to your point, it's a question I've asked myself often. I think in the last few years, there is a box now that is 2 or more races, which is what I tick.
Okay.
Especially when I'm filling out the forms. However, my background is somewhat interesting in the sense that it is a mix where my family is East Timorese, which is an indigenous country.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's Southeast Asian. Um, my great grandfather is Chinese because
Okay.
East Timor had Chinese merchants that had come over. On my grandfather's side, we come from a Portuguese lineage because the Portuguese were the colonizers that had come. And so I have those that's already a mix. I'm born in Australia. And then we also have Mozambique blood as well from my father's mother's side. So that's African.
Yeah.
So I was looking at it, and then now I've got 2 organs from who knows where, right? And I'm an American citizen. So it's an interesting, yeah, it's an interesting thing. And I personally don't prescribe to labels. I don't even prescribe to labels like, oh, this person is smart or
Yeah.
funny, or because I think
Okay.
we can be a realm of things at any given point,
Yeah.
or we have access to be if we want to be.
Mm-hmm.
So it was actually really hard for me too
Yeah.
to look at that and kind of go, okay, you have to go in one of these. Like you have to
I
pick
mean,
one.
doesn't it just, your story completely debunks
Yeah.
race as a construct,
Right.
right? And it highlights the importance of understanding either ethnicity or cultural differences.
Yes.
Being first generation, meaning your home life perhaps really took a lot of cultural influence from East Timor, right? But then, you're socialized in the education system of Australia and the
Right.
workplace. So you've got those cultural inputs. How different was it moving to the US? Was there a cultural shock in any way? Like what was similar or what was different for you?
It was very much a cultural shock.
Okay.
When I moved, it was 2002.
Mm-hmm.
The internet had only been around for a handful of years at that point.
Yep.
So it wasn't like we had, full access to see everywhere and everything so we knew what to expect. So for me, it was very different. It was super different. I had to learn how to write checks, which like we never did in Australia.
Mm-hmm.
And so at least I don't remember having to write checks, which was brand new. Social Security was like a whole thing. Medical insurance, don't even get me started. I'm still trying to figure it out on like, what do these terms mean?
Mm-hmm.
So even though I came over speaking English, it didn't feel like it felt like a whole second language I had to learn.
Yeah. I mean, mind you, I don't know about you, but I've been at the grocery store with my husband who is British, so he has an English accent. The person behind the register once said to us, "What language are you guys speaking?" We're like, "English?" What did you find hardest integrating into a workplace here? Was there anything in particular?
I will say the paperwork was very intimidating,
Mm-hmm.
especially being on a visa, right? Because it was like you don't really belong, but you kind of belong, but are you even allowed to work here?
Yeah.
That was very confronting. And then it was sort of like at any moment you can not work here and you
Yeah.
have to go home.
Yeah.
And so that instability or that feeling behind it,
Yeah.
even if it's perceived, it was like enough to sort of have me on point. Like I can't get a speeding ticket ever
Yeah.
was the feeling of it, right? Like, but I think the hardest part, so throughout my entire journey of transplantation, I have worked.
What are the allowances usually?
Normally it's 2 weeks full time. I think there's 3 days of bereavement, 5 days of sick leave. There is short-term disability and disability in general. But this is one of the things that I'm extremely committed to
Mm-hmm.
is, and this is why I loved that you had chronic illness even on this list. In my own experience, this is something we don't talk about. Because when people heard that I was on dialysis, they were like, and you still worked?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, I was on dialysis for 5 years. Like, what am I supposed to do? Take 5 years off? That's not even a thing.
And explain to our listeners what it means to be on dialysis. How do you schedule that into your work day, work week, let's call it?
Yeah. There's two types. One type, you go into the center, which was for me 3 days a week.
Mm-hmm.
And then another type, you do overnight every day.
Mm-hmm.
So I did both. I did one for 1 year and one for the second year.
Mm-hmm.
I would be sitting in a dialysis unit, which has probably 30 people, all sitting on big sort of lounge chair type seating. And I'd be on conference calls with my laptop. And it would be beeping behind me and what have you. And I would still be doing whatever I needed to do. I led teams. And at the time, I was running accounts at a media agency, which were Fortune 500s. So Wells Fargo, AT&T, Activision, Warner Brothers, CBS, NBC, like big accounts that the world spins on them, right? Like everything was urgent. And so for me, I didn't have an option but to do that. And thankfully, I led teams of people where I taught to lead from an empathetic standpoint, still very high performing. So that didn't mean that there was any gap. But what it did mean was I had to be a master of communicating what I could do, couldn't do, and making sure that what I couldn't do was covered by someone else
Mm-hmm.
and we would help each other. And
Yeah.
so what that sharpened was my ability to build teams that were focused purely on leveraging that person's strength and mastery and not working at all on what they were weak at. It was like, look, if you're weak at 60% of this, let's get someone else who's 100% great at it and we can trade off. And then we've got two job descriptions covered by two people.
Yeah.
But I wasn't precious at all if it meant that three people had to team up because one was better at PowerPoint and one sucked at Excel. It was like, that's great. You guys figure it out. This is the end task, but we can sort of make mini SWAT teams here and work through that. And so I was very much supported by amazing teams that trusted my leadership, appreciated my direction, saw my gifts,
Mm.
and gave me the grace to be able to lead.
The way you describe that story to me, Shana, is that it was fortuitous that you already were a person or a human-centered leader, that you'd already created that organic team based on strengths and all that kind of stuff, which meant that you had the trust in place, that you had the psychological safety in place, that you could then get your needs met and still function business as usual, so to speak. If we use that as a selling proposition to anyone that might be listening that has not yet created a team that functions like that, that just puts people in their boxes, that isn't vulnerable or has created a safe place for people to have their needs met over time, if or when the time comes and you need your needs met, whether it's through chronic illness in the example, or acute illness that someone might be experiencing, right through to caring responsibilities, sudden grief, like those kinds of things, you're able to then have your needs met because you'd created an environment that enabled that for others as well, leading up to that.
I haven't always succeeded in it. So I definitely don't want to give the perception that it's like something to arrive at, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a daily practice, a daily practice. I personally think we underrate psychological safety enormously. That was my number one priority. This was my mantra. You never have to guess how I feel about something when you're around me. If I don't like it, you'll know about it. If I love it, you'll know about it.
Yeah.
That was my number one thing, was to make sure that I would check myself on where am I? That's my definition of communication, not just the words coming out of my mouth, but it has to all match my feelings, matching my words, matching my actions, matching my thoughts.
Yeah, that's great. And that's a really good tip. I often speak about psychological safety and creating the safe space for people to be able to be themselves and speak up and have their needs met. And we talk like it's a cerebral concept to many people, right? Oh, how do I create psychological safety? Be authentic. Okay, so how do I do that? How do I, vulnerable? How do I do that? And when you're saying is say what you mean what you say, and back it up and follow through. And if people can rely on you to be that, then that's creating psychological safety. So I love that you've created a very concrete example for people where it might be too much of a fluffy concept.
Thank you. Yeah, and it's like I say, daily practice.
Yeah.
I didn't always succeed, but I also think in the times that you don't, it's important to be able to say, you know what, I said I liked that, but I actually didn't. I lied, like.
That's authentic leadership. Not
Mhm.
about being perfect. We can always do better today and tomorrow.
Exactly.
What I'd love to know is what you're doing now. How have you brought all of this amazing, as you call it, privilege of lived experience? How are you packaging up that now and bringing that to the world?
I'm the person that if a friend breaks up with someone, they come to me to get a game plan together, as opposed to like sit and cry and watch a sad movie. We have other friends for that, from the standpoint of being action orientated versus purely inspiring or purely motivational. Actually showing people, when you're faced with a medical crisis, here's what you can do.
Mm-hmm.
This is what you can do, because what your natural body response is fight or flight. And generally, it's going to be freeze. And so, what I do now is I support people in the journey where they go to the doctor, they get life altering medical news, they come out of there with a referral to a specialist, and they're expected to go back to their job, go pick up the kids from school, go, grocery shopping, get dinner, whatever they were doing 30 minutes before that. And yet their entire lives has just blown up. Right at that moment is where I come in and say, we've got this.
When we're so overwhelmed, even if we are the kind of person that's really good at action and taking steps, when the rug's swept up from under you, you go into a position of stress and you lose all of your natural capabilities. And so it's lovely to know, in fact, that there are services out there like yourself that can step in when it's needed most. And what I'll do is make sure all your contact details are in the podcast description so people can find you. Thank you so much for your time today, Shana. I cannot wait to release this episode. I learned so much with you today. And I hope that I get to come and see you in California or you come to see me in Colorado.
I would love to. Thank you so much.